"Johnson, you're out of your league here. This isn't college anymore." Those were the last words my supervisor, Rick Williams, said to me. This was just moments before the main reactor would start overheating at 2,000 degrees, the evacuation alarms would start screaming, and molten chemicals would begin eating through the containment walls, with 847 people still inside the blast radius. That's when Rick Williams discovered that the diversity hire he'd been sabotaging for 8 months was the only person in that plant who might know how to stop it. My name is Jalen Johnson. I'm a chemical engineer with 12 years of experience, and the man who spent 8 months calling me incompetent. He was about to find out just how wrong he'd been. I was 36 when I got hired at Lone Star Chemical, the biggest petrochemical plant in Houston. On paper, it should have been a dream job. Senior process engineer, 6-figure salary, leading a team of 12 experienced technicians. But from day one, I knew I had a target on my back. See, Lone Star Chemical had been an all-white boys club for 43 years. The kind of place where promotions happened over beers at the local bar, where cultural fit was code for looks like us, and where safety violations got buried under handshake agreements. Then the Department of Labor came knocking. Discrimination lawsuit, federal investigation, headlines in the Houston Chronicle about systematic exclusion of minority engineers. Suddenly, Lone Star needed some diversity, and they needed it quickly to satisfy the federal investigators and avoid massive penalties. That's where I came in. My name is Jalen Johnson, chemical engineer from Prairie View AM, 12 years of experience at 3 different plants, spotless safety record, and exactly the kind of qualified minority hire that would make their legal problems disappear. Rick Williams, my direct supervisor, made it clear from day one that I wasn't welcome. "Nothing personal, Johnson," he said during my first week, "but I hope you can keep up. We don't have time to hold anyone's hand around here." This coming from a man who'd never worked anywhere else, whose daddy got him his first job at the plant 20 years ago, and whose idea of innovation was, "That's not how we've always done it." The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was Rick, lecturing me about keeping up, when his greatest professional achievement was inheriting his position through family connections. While I'd earned my stripes at 3 different facilities, optimizing processes and implementing safety improvements that saved companies millions, Rick had spent 2 decades doing the same job the exact same way his father taught him. I'd seen his type before, threatened by change, intimidated by actual expertise, comfortable only when surrounded by people who looked exactly like him and thought exactly like him. The kind of supervisor who confused seniority with competence and mistook volume for authority. But I kept my mouth shut, did my job, tried to prove myself the only way I knew how, through excellence. That was my first mistake. See, Rick Williams didn't want me to succeed. He wanted me to fail spectacularly, so he could point to management and say, "See? I told you diversity hires don't work." My wife, Sarah, could see what it was doing to me. "Jalen, baby, you come home every night looking like someone died. This job is killing you." She was right, but we had a mortgage, 2 kids in school, and my previous plant had downsized 6 months before I got this opportunity. I couldn't afford to quit. I had to make this work. Week 2. Rick assigns me to oversee the night shift reactor maintenance. Sounds important, right? Except he forgot to mention that the maintenance crew had been given conflicting instructions by the day shift supervisor. I caught the discrepancy, fixed it, prevented what could have been a minor explosion. Rick's response: "Lucky catch, Johnson. Try not to rely on luck too much." The dig was intentional. In front of 6 technicians, he dismissed my competence as mere luck. I felt heat rise in my face, but forced myself to stay calm. Getting angry would only prove his point. 2 weeks later, Rick puts me in charge of the new safety protocol implementation. Federal mandate, company-wide rollout, high-visibility project. Then he schedules every meeting during times I'm required to be on the floor. Doesn't forward me critical emails. Forgets to include me in planning sessions. When I miss a deadline because I literally didn't know about it, Rick documents it as failure to meet basic project requirements. That night, I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could drive home. My hands were shaking with frustration. I'd never been set up to fail so systematically. 2 months later, the quarterly safety inspection is coming up. Rick assigns me to prepare the documentation for Sector 7, the most complex part of the plant. 3 days before the inspection, he tells me there's been a miscommunication and I'm actually responsible for Sectors 7, 8, and 9. I worked 18-hour days for 3 straight days, cross-referencing maintenance logs, updating safety protocols, ensuring every valve, every pressure gauge, every emergency system was documented perfectly. Sarah had to explain to our kids why Daddy wasn't home for dinner again. The inspection? Flawless. 0 violations in my sectors. Rick's feedback in my performance review. Adequate preparation, though the rushed timeline raised questions about planning abilities. This man was literally punishing me for succeeding despite his sabotage. But I started doing something Rick didn't expect. I began documenting everything, every conversation, every sabotaged project, every safety concern Rick dismissed, every diversity hire comment. I kept detailed logs with timestamps, witnesses, and copies of every email. I also started building relationships outside of Rick's influence. I connected with Janet Morrison, the plant's head of regulatory compliance. She'd been fighting for safety upgrades for years, but lacked the technical expertise to make compelling arguments to management. I reached out to Dr. Susan Martinez, who ran the safety training program for new hires. She'd been looking for someone with real-world experience to help update their curriculum. I built alliances with the night shift supervisors, who Rick rarely interacted with. These were the guys who dealt with the actual consequences of his shortcuts and outdated procedures. Most importantly, I started studying every system in that plant. Not because I was assigned to, not because it was my job, because Rick's dismissal of my safety concerns kept me awake at night. By month 6, Rick's campaign against me had spread to the rest of the team. Casual comments in meetings about affirmative action engineers, jokes about book learning versus real experience, questions about whether I'd actually earned my degree. The worst part, some of these guys were actually decent people individually, but in Rick's presence they transformed into a pack mentality that I'd seen too many times before. The same technicians who'd ask for my help privately would sit silent when Rick made his comments publicly. There was Tommy Rodriguez, a maintenance supervisor, who'd privately told me my safety suggestions had prevented 2 potential accidents. But when Rick questioned my competence in meetings, Tommy would suddenly find his paperwork fascinating. There was Dave Martinez, a senior operator with 25 years' experience, who'd sought my advice on modernizing his department's procedures, but he never spoke up when Rick dismissed my recommendations as textbook theory. The breaking point came during a team meeting about upgrading the main reactor system. I'd been studying the blueprints for weeks. I knew that system better than anyone in that room. I'd worked on identical setups at 2 of my previous plants. I had legitimate concerns about the temperature sensors they wanted to install. Rick, I said, these Series 200 sensors have a history of delayed response at high temperatures. I've seen them fail during thermal events at my previous facility in Beaumont. We should consider the Series 400 units instead. Silence. Then Rick laughed. Actually laughed. Johnson, I appreciate the input, but this isn't your community college lab. We've been running plants like this since before you knew what a reactor was. The sensors we're using have been industry standard for 15 years. Community college lab. The disrespect was intentional and calculated. My degree was from Prairie View AM, a respected 4-year university. But that's exactly the problem, I pressed, my voice steady despite my rising anger. The industry standard failed at the Baytown facility in 2019. They had the identical setup and sensors that we're planning to install. Johnson, Rick's voice cut through the room like a blade. I'm going to stop you right there. We're not redesigning our entire system because you read about some accident online. These decisions get made by people with real experience, not diversity hires trying to prove how smart they are. Diversity hire, he said it, out loud, in front of 12 people. The room went dead quiet. A few guys looked uncomfortable. Most just stared at their papers. But here's what broke my heart. I saw Tommy Rodriguez wince. I saw Dave Martinez shake his head slightly. These men knew Rick was wrong. They knew I was right. They knew the Baytown incident wasn't just some accident online. It was a preventable disaster that killed 3 people and injured dozens more. But they said nothing. That's when I realized I wasn't just fighting Rick Williams. I was fighting a system that valued comfort over courage, conformity over competence. I could have filed a complaint, could have gone to HR, could have made a scene. Instead, I did something that would either save lives or cost them. I kept documenting everything, but now I also started building a detailed analysis of every safety vulnerability in that plant. I studied the manual override systems that hadn't been used in years. I memorized the emergency protocols that most people had forgotten. I prepared for disasters that Rick insisted would never happen because I had a feeling his arrogance was going to get people killed. September 15th, 2:47 p.m. I was in the break room reviewing maintenance logs when the first alarm went off. Not the routine maintenance alarm, not the minor leak alarm, the catastrophic system failure alarm, the sound that means you have minutes, not hours, before people start dying. I dropped my coffee and ran towards Sector 7. The main reactor was overheating, temperature climbing past safe levels, the cooling system wasn't responding, and the temperature sensors, the exact Series 200 units I'd warned about, were giving readings that lagged behind actual conditions. By the time the alarms went off, the reactor was already at critical temperature. I could see Rick through the observation window, frantically pushing buttons on the control panel, yelling into his radio. His face was white as paper. Sweat was pouring down his forehead as he realized that all his dismissive confidence couldn't fix what was happening. The evacuation sirens started blaring throughout the plant. 847 people worked at that plant, 847 people who now had maybe 20 minutes to get out before the reactor went critical and took half of Houston with it. But there was a problem. An explosion in Sector 5 had damaged the main evacuation routes. The blast had twisted metal walkways and ruptured pipes, blocking the primary exits. Groups of workers were trapped in different sections of the plant. Emergency coordinators were screaming over the intercom. Sector 6 control room, 12 operators trapped, exit routes blocked. Maintenance tunnel team, can't reach surface level. Sector 9 cleanup crew, need immediate assistance. Rick was trying to coordinate the evacuation while simultaneously attempting to control the reactor failure. But he was failing at both. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely operate the control panels. That's when I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Rick didn't know about the manual override system. In his 20 years at this plant, following the exact same procedures his father had taught him, Rick Williams had never learned about the emergency systems that could bypass the failed sensors. He didn't know about the secondary cooling line that hadn't been activated in 8 years, but was still functional. He had no idea how to stop this, but I did. I'd spent months studying every inch of that reactor system, not because I was assigned to, not because it was my job, because Rick's dismissal of my safety concerns had kept me awake at night, driving me to understand every possible failure point. I knew there was a way to stop this disaster, maybe, but I had to get to the manual override controls in Building C, Sub-Level 2, and Rick Williams was about to discover whether the diversity hire he'd been sabotaging could actually save his life. I burst into the control room. Rick was on the radio with corporate, sweat pouring down his face, his voice cracking with panic. The reactor's at 1,950 degrees and climbing. Cooling systems not responding. We need to evacuate the entire facility. He saw me and his face twisted with anger and desperation. Johnson, what the hell are you doing here? Didn't you hear the evacuation order? Rick, listen to me. I kept my voice calm despite the chaos around us. The temperature sensors are lagging behind actual conditions. The reactor's actually much hotter than the readings show. We have less time than you think. Get out! Security is going to escort everyone. There's a manual override, I shouted over the alarms. Building C, Sub-Level 2. If we can activate the secondary cooling line and bypass the sensor array, we can bring the temperature down. Rick stared at me like I was speaking another language. In his panic, he was reverting to everything he knew, which wasn't enough. Johnson, you don't know what you're talking about. The manual system hasn't been used in 8 years. I know. I've been studying the blueprints for months because you wouldn't listen to me about the sensors. The temperature alarm hit 2,000 degrees. The sound was deafening. Because you wouldn't listen to me about the sensors. Because I knew this could happen. Because while you were busy calling me a diversity hire, I was trying to keep people alive." For the first time in 8 months, Rick Williams was speechless. In that moment, with disaster bearing down on us, he finally understood that his prejudice had been the real threat all along. The reactor temperature hit 2100 degrees. The containment vessel was starting to show stress fractures. We had maybe 8 minutes before complete containment failure. "Rick," I said, looking him dead in the eyes, "I can try to fix this, but I need you to coordinate the trapped worker evacuations while I go to the override controls. Can you do that?" The man who had spent 8 months undermining me, sabotaging me, calling me incompetent, nodded. "What do you need me to do?" "Get on the radio. Guide the emergency teams to the alternate evacuation routes. And Rick," I paused at the door, "trust the people who actually know what they're doing." What happened next was the most intense 15 minutes of my life. "Johnson, the main access to Building C is blocked." Rick's voice crackled over the radio. His tone completely changed from his usual condescension. "Explosion in Sector 5 took out the walkway." I could see it from where I stood. Twisted metal, flames licking up from ruptured pipes. The normal route was gone. "I'm going through the maintenance tunnels," I radioed back. "Those tunnels run right under the reactor. If containment fails while you're down there, then I'll have about 3 seconds to think about all the times you should have listened to me." The maintenance tunnels were never meant for emergency access. 4 feet wide, minimal ventilation, ambient temperature already climbing from the overheating reactor above. The concrete walls were hot enough that I could feel the heat through my protective suit. Halfway through, the lights cut out. Emergency power had failed in this section. I was crawling in absolute darkness, guided only by memory and the increasing heat that told me I was getting closer to the reactor core. My respirator was fogging up from my own panicked breathing, and sweat was stinging my eyes. Then I heard it, a deep metallic groan from above. The reactor containment vessel was starting to buckle under the thermal stress. "Johnson, where are you?" Rick's voice, barely audible through static. "Almost there," I gasped, though I had no idea if that was true. When I finally reached the manual override room, the temperature gauge on the wall read 158 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was so hot it hurt to breathe. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip the valve wheels. The first valve was seized, hadn't been turned in 8 years, just like I'd told Rick. I threw my entire body weight against it. Nothing. Temperature climbing, 2,200 degrees. I grabbed a pipe from the maintenance kit on the wall, used it as a lever. The valve shrieked like a wounded animal and finally gave way. 1 down, 3 to go. The second valve opened easier, but as soon as I turned it, superheated steam burst from a crack in the pipe above me. It caught my left shoulder, burning straight through my protective suit. I bit through my lip to keep from screaming. Any sound might distract Rick from coordinating the evacuations. "Johnson, we're at 2300. Whatever you're doing, you need to hurry." The radio cut to static. I was on my own. The third valve was behind a panel that had warped from the heat. I had to kick it 7 times before it buckled enough to reach inside. My boots were starting to melt. I could smell the rubber burning. That's when I heard the voices, not on the radio, through the ventilation system. "Trapped in Sector 6, the exit's blocked. Please, someone, we can't get out." 12 operators were trapped in the control room directly above the reactor. If I failed, they'd be the first to die. I could hear them praying, crying, calling their families on cell phones to say goodbye. One voice cut through clearer than the others. "Tommy Rodriguez. Tell my daughter I love her. Tell her Daddy tried to come home." No, not today. Not on my watch. I reached the final valve, the master coolant release, but the wheel was glowing red hot, literally glowing from the heat, no way to touch it without third-degree burns. I looked around desperately, spotted a fire blanket in a melted case on the wall, wrapped it around my hands, knowing it would only give me seconds before the heat burned through. Gripped the valve, turned. The pain was indescribable. Even through the blanket, I could feel my palms blistering, skin separating from muscle. But I kept turning. 1 rotation, 2, 3. Then I heard it. The beautiful, life-saving sound of coolant flooding the system. the blessed rush of thousands of gallons of emergency coolant hitting the superheated reactor core. But I wasn't done. "Rick!" I screamed into the radio, my voice hoarse from the heat and smoke. "The trapped operators in Sector 6. You need to reverse the ventilation flow. Pull the emergency override in panel C7. "What? That's not in any protocol I know." "Do it now. The coolant's going to create a pressure differential. You have 30 seconds before the air in that room becomes toxic." I could hear Rick shouting orders in the background. 25 seconds later, Tommy Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. "We're out. We're all out. Jesus Christ, we're alive." I collapsed against the wall, hands destroyed, shoulder screaming, boots literally melted to my feet. The temperature in the room was starting to drop, but I couldn't move. Everything hurt. Everything burned. But they were alive. All of them. That's when I heard the structural alarm. The walkway above the tunnels, my only exit route, was failing from the heat damage. "Johnson, the tunnel's collapsing. Get out now." I couldn't run, could barely walk. But I crawled, dragged myself through those maintenance tunnels as concrete chunks fell around me, as pipes burst and sprayed scalding water, as the entire infrastructure groaned and threatened to bury me alive. I made it out just as the tunnel entrance collapsed completely, emerged into daylight looking like I'd crawled through hell. Because I had. The medical team was waiting. As they loaded me onto a gurney, I saw them. The 12 operators from Sector 6. Tommy Rodriguez was crying, clutching his phone with his daughter still on the line. "You saved us," he kept saying through his tears. "You saved us all." My hands were wrapped in gauze, shoulder packed in ice, feet being cut out of my melted boots. But I was alive. They were alive. All 847 workers were alive. Rick Williams stood next to my gurney, his face a mixture of awe, shame, and something I'd never seen from him before. Respect. "Johnson, your hands. You might have permanent damage." I looked him in the eye, my voice barely a whisper. Better than 847 people having permanent death. 3 hours later, after the medical team had stabilized my burns and wrapped what was left of my hands, the entire plant management team was waiting outside the medical facility. Plant manager Robert Hayes, safety director Linda Park, and 3 corporate executives who'd been helicoptered in from Dallas the moment the alarms started. But the first person I saw was Rick. He walked up to me, his face pale and drawn, still trembling from what we'd all just witnessed. "Johnson," he said, his voice carrying across the parking lot loud enough for everyone to hear. "You just saved 847 lives." Then, quieter, with tears in his eyes, including mine. For the first time, I saw something in Rick Williams I'd never seen before, genuine humility, the realization that his prejudice had nearly cost hundreds of people their lives, that the man he'd spent 8 months trying to destroy was the only reason he was still breathing. Plant manager Hayes stepped forward. "Jalen, what you did today, I don't have words, but I want you to know that this company owes you a debt we can never repay." "Sir," I said, wincing as the painkillers began to wear off, "all I want is for this to never happen again, and for qualified people to be heard before disasters strike, not after." The message was clear to everyone standing there. The federal investigation team arrived within 24 hours. OSHA inspectors, EPA specialists, chemical safety experts from the Chemical Safety Board, and investigators from the Department of Homeland Security. When chemical plants nearly explode, everyone takes notice. I was interviewed for 8 hours over 2 days, with breaks for medical treatment. They wanted to understand every detail of the manual override procedure, every step of the emergency response, every decision I'd made in those critical 15 minutes. But what they really wanted to know about was the 8 months leading up to the incident. "Mr. Johnson," said lead investigator Sarah Martinez, "you documented 43 safety concerns over 8 months, 43 separate warnings about system vulnerabilities, sensor failures, and procedural gaps. Can you explain why none of these were addressed?" I handed over my files. 8 months of ignored recommendations, dismissed warnings, and Rick's written responses calling my concerns overcautious and unnecessary. The investigators spent a week reviewing every document, every email, every maintenance log. They interviewed every member of our team, every technician, every operator who'd worked with the reactor system. What they found was damning. Rick had overridden safety protocols 31 times in 3 years. He'd delayed critical maintenance to save money. He'd ignored manufacturer warnings about the temperature sensors I'd flagged. He'd even falsified inspection reports to avoid regulatory scrutiny. But here's the part that made national news. The temperature sensors that failed during our incident were part of a batch that had been recalled by the manufacturer 8 months earlier. Rick had received the recall notice and filed it away without taking action because, in his words to investigators, Johnson keeps crying about those sensors, but he doesn't know how things work in the real world. 8 months. We'd been operating with defective sensors for 8 months because Rick Williams couldn't admit that the diversity hire had been right about the equipment failures. "Mr. Johnson," Investigator Martinez said during our final interview, "if you hadn't known about the manual override system, if you hadn't spent months studying those blueprints, if you hadn't been prepared for exactly this scenario, we estimate the explosion would have been equivalent to 2.8 tons of TNT. The blast radius would have extended into 4 residential neighborhoods. We're looking at potentially 4,200 casualties, not just the 847 plant workers. 4,200 people, families, children, elderly residents in nearby nursing homes, all because Rick Williams was too proud to listen to a black engineer who actually knew what he was talking about." The final investigative report was 847 pages long, 1 page for every life that was saved. It became required reading at chemical engineering programs across the country. The Lone Star incident is now a case study in how workplace discrimination doesn't just hurt individuals. It creates systematic safety risks that can kill thousands. The report concluded with a statement that's now quoted in industrial safety textbooks. The near-catastrophic failure at Lone Star Chemical was not caused by equipment malfunction or human error. It was caused by institutional bias that prevented critical safety information from reaching decision-makers. Organizations that silence competent voices based on prejudice don't just create hostile work environments, they create deadly ones. Rick Williams wasn't just fired for harassment. The federal investigation revealed criminal negligence that sent him to prison for a very long time. The falsified inspection reports alone carried a potential 15-year sentence. The ignored recall notices were federal safety violations punishable by 12 years each. The pattern of deliberately disregarding safety protocols that endangered 847 workers qualified as criminal recklessness under Texas law. But the prosecutors wanted more than just Rick. They wanted to send a message to every supervisor in every plant across America. Your prejudice can kill people, and we will hold you accountable. Rick was charged with 31 counts of criminal negligence, 8 counts of federal safety violations, 847 counts of reckless endangerment, multiple counts of falsifying federal inspection documents, and criminal conspiracy to conceal safety violations. His lawyer tried to negotiate. Rick would cooperate with ongoing investigations into industry-wide safety failures in exchange for reduced charges. The prosecutor's response? Mr. Williams nearly caused the worst industrial disaster in American history because he was too prejudiced to listen to a qualified engineer. There is no deal. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. Rick's own emails and documented statements proved his bias and negligence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Rick Williams was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. His engineering license was permanently revoked. His pension was forfeited to fund safety improvements at chemical plants nationwide. His assets were seized to pay restitution to the 847 workers who nearly died because of his negligence. But here's the part that really destroyed him. During sentencing, the judge read victim impact statements from 23 workers, including Tommy Rodriguez. "Your Honor," Tommy said, "I want the court to know that I was a coward. I watched Rick Williams sabotage Jalen Johnson for 8 months. I knew Jalen was right about the safety issues. I knew Rick was putting all of us in danger, but I said nothing because it was easier to go along than to stand up. Jalen Johnson saved my life, and I almost let Rick Williams take it from me. I have to live with that shame forever, But Rick Williams should live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. 23 workers gave similar statements. 23 people who admitted they'd watched Rick try to destroy me and done nothing to stop it. Rick Williams sat in that courtroom and listened to 23 people testify that they knew he was wrong, knew I was right, and stayed silent anyway. That's when he finally broke down and cried. Not from remorse, from the realization that even his own team knew he was incompetent. The physical recovery took 10 months, not 3. Third-degree burns on both hands, second-degree burns on my shoulder and back, smoke inhalation that left me with permanent lung scarring. But the psychological wounds ran deeper than the physical ones. I had nightmares for months. The sound of any alarm, even my phone's ringtone, would send me into a panic. I'd wake up in cold sweats, feeling the heat from those tunnels, hearing Tommy Rodriguez calling his daughter to say goodbye. The PTSD was real, and it was debilitating. Sarah sat by my hospital bed every day for 2 weeks. "Baby, you don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. You saved 847 lives, you're a hero." But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt angry that it had taken a near disaster for people to listen to me. Angry that Tommy Rodriguez and Dave Martinez and all the others had watched me be humiliated for months and said nothing. Angry that it took 847 people nearly dying for the system to change. The trauma counselor helped me understand that survivor's guilt was normal, that replaying those 15 minutes over and over, wondering if I could have moved faster, saved more people, was part of the healing process. It took 2 years of therapy before I could hear an alarm without my heart racing. "You know what the worst part is?" I told Sarah one night, when the pain medication wasn't helping and I couldn't sleep. If that reactor hadn't overheated, Rick would still be there, still sabotaging people like me, still putting lives at risk because he can't stand the idea that a black man might know more than he does. "But it did happen," Sarah said, squeezing my bandaged hand gently. "And now everyone knows who you really are. Not just the plant, the whole industry. You changed everything, Jalen." She was right. Letters started arriving from engineers across the country, people sharing their own stories of being dismissed, undermined, ignored, people thanking me for proving that competence matters more than color. But the letter that meant the most came from an unexpected source, Rick Williams writing from federal prison. "Johnson," it read, "I know I got no right to ask for anything from you, but I need you to know that I was wrong. Not just about the sensors or the safety protocols. I was wrong about you. I let my fear and prejudice nearly kill 847 people, including myself. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what you tried to tell me. Being right isn't about where you come from or what you look like. It's about knowing what you're talking about. You knew. I didn't listen. I'm sorry." I never wrote back. But I kept the letter. A reminder that even the most prejudiced person can eventually learn the truth, even if it costs them everything. 2 years later, I was sitting in the executive boardroom on the 40th floor of Lone Star Chemical's corporate headquarters in Houston. My hands still bore the scars from that day, but they worked. I could hold a pen, operate controls, shake hands with the people who now looked to me for leadership. "Jalen," said CEO Margaret Torres, "we're promoting you to Director of Safety Operations for the entire corporation. Full oversight of all reactor operations, plant-wide safety protocols, and emergency response systems across 12 facilities." "Thank you, Ma'am." "There's something else. The Board of Directors wants to implement the Johnson Safety Protocol across all Lone Star facilities. Your manual override procedures, your sensor redundancy recommendations, your emergency response framework, it's all going to become standard operating procedure. The Johnson Safety Protocol, named after the diversity hire who'd been sabotaged for 8 months. And Jalen, there's one more thing. Before his arrest, Rick Williams applied for a position at our competitor, Gulf Coast Chemical. They called for a reference. I raised an eyebrow. I told them the truth, that Rick Williams is the kind of supervisor who would rather see his plant explode than admit a black engineer knew more than he did, that his prejudice nearly caused the worst industrial disaster in American history, and that any company that hires him is assuming a liability that could destroy them. Rick Williams never worked in chemical engineering again. Not that it mattered. He had 18 years in federal prison to think about his choices. Today, I'm Director of Safety Operations for the entire Lone Star Chemical Corporation. 12 plants, 8,000 employees, $2.8 billion in annual revenue. The safety protocols I developed after that near disaster have been adopted industry-wide. The Johnson standards are now federal requirements for all petrochemical facilities. I've prevented 6 major accidents, saved countless lives, and built a safety culture that prioritizes competence over comfort, substance over appearance. But the real victory? 2 years ago, I got a call from a young Latina engineer at our Beaumont facility. Her supervisor was undermining her, questioning her competence, making diversity hire comments. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "I know about what happened to you. I know about Rick Williams. I need help." I flew to Beaumont that afternoon, had a meeting with plant management that evening. Her supervisor was transferred to a different department the next day. But here's what I discovered. That young engineer, Maria Santos, had been documenting everything just like I had. She'd been building alliances with safety-conscious colleagues just like I had. She'd been studying systems and procedures that others ignored, just like I had. The difference? She didn't have to wait 8 months to be heard. She didn't have to prevent a disaster to prove her worth. She had someone in her corner from day one. That's when I realized the most important part of my story isn't about Rick Williams getting his comeuppance. It's about creating a system where the next Jalen Johnson doesn't have to go through what I went through. So I started the Lone Star Mentorship Program. Every new engineer, regardless of background, gets paired with a senior engineer who's committed to their success. We've eliminated the old boys network promotions. We've implemented 360-degree reviews where supervisors are evaluated by their direct reports, not just their superiors. Most importantly, we've created a culture where speaking up about safety concerns is rewarded, not punished, where asking questions is seen as diligence, not defiance, where competence matters more than conformity. Today, Lone Star Chemical has the best safety record in the industry. We've gone 1,947 days without a single recordable incident. Our employee satisfaction scores are through the roof. Our retention rate for minority engineers is 96%, the highest in the sector. Last month, I got a letter from Maria Santos. She'd just been promoted to senior process engineer at the Beaumont facility, the youngest person ever to hold that position. "Mr. Johnson," she wrote, "thank you for showing me that excellence doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs opportunity to shine." That letter is framed on my office wall, right next to my engineering degree from Prairie View AM, and a photo of my family, Sarah and our 2 kids, who watched their father nearly die to save people who had dismissed him. Some days, when I'm dealing with corporate politics or budget battles or the 1,000 small frustrations that come with leadership, I look at that letter and remember why this matters. It's not about proving Rick Williams wrong anymore. He's spending the next decade in federal prison thinking about his mistakes. It's about proving Maria Santos right, and the next engineer after her, and the one after that. 7 years later, the impact extends far beyond Lone Star Chemical. The Johnson Safety Protocol has been implemented at over 200 chemical facilities across North America. It's credited with preventing at least 12 major incidents and saving an estimated 15,000 lives. I've testified before Congress 3 times about workplace discrimination in high-risk industries. My story is now part of mandatory diversity training at major corporations across multiple sectors. But the most meaningful change happened last year. I received a call from the Dean of Engineering at Prairie View AM, my alma mater. They wanted to establish the Jalen Johnson Center for Industrial Safety and Workplace Equity, a research institute dedicated to studying how bias and discrimination create safety risks in technical fields. "We want you to lead it," Dean Williams told me, "part-time initially, while you maintain your role at Lone Star. But eventually, we hope you'll consider coming back to academia full-time." The irony wasn't lost on me. The same expertise that Rick Williams had dismissed as textbook theory was now being recognized as groundbreaking enough to warrant its own research center. I accepted. The center opened 6 months ago. Our first cohort includes 24 graduate students from diverse backgrounds, all studying how to make high-risk industries safer by ensuring all voices are heard. Tommy Rodriguez, the maintenance supervisor who had stayed silent during Rick's harassment, was our first industry partnership coordinator. He left Lone Star to help us build bridges between academia and industry. "I can't undo my cowardice," he told me during his interview, "but I can spend the rest of my career making sure other people don't stay silent like I did." Dave Martinez joined us as well, heading our practical training division. The man who had sought my advice privately but never defended me publicly now trains supervisors on how to recognize and amplify competent voices regardless of their source. "Jalen," he said on his first day, "I learned the hard way that staying quiet isn't neutral. It's taking a side. I want to teach people to take the right side from the beginning." I never visited Rick Williams in prison, but I kept track of his case through the legal system. He served 12 years of his 18-year sentence before being granted early release for good behavior and participation in educational programs. While incarcerated, he earned a degree in conflict resolution and completed extensive training in unconscious bias and workplace discrimination. Upon his release, he tried to reach out to me multiple times, letters, phone calls, even showing up at the Prairie View campus during one of my lectures. I finally agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near the university. The man who walked in looked nothing like the arrogant supervisor who had tormented me. Prison had aged him dramatically. His hair was completely grey, his face lined with what looked like genuine remorse. "Jalen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know I got no right to ask for anything from you, but I wanted to tell you in person what I did to you, what I put those workers through. It wasn't just wrong. It was evil." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-pity. I found neither. "I spent 12 years thinking about what you went through," he continued. "How you saved my life after I spent 8 months trying to destroy your career. How you burned your hands to save people who had watched me humiliate you and said nothing. What do you want from me, Rick?" "Nothing," he said immediately. "I don't want forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted to tell you that I understand now. I understand what my prejudice cost. Not just you, but everyone. I understand that you didn't save those 847 people in spite of being black. You saved them because you were competent, prepared, and brave. Things I never was." He slid a newspaper clipping across the table. It was an article about the Johnson Center, with a photo of me speaking at the dedication ceremony. "I keep this," he said, "to remind me of what real leadership looks like, what I could have learned from you if I hadn't been so threatened by your competence." We sat in silence for several minutes. "What are you doing now?" I asked. "I work at a community center in East Houston, teaching GED classes, helping ex-offenders find jobs, minimum wage, but it's honest work. And Jalen, I make sure every person who walks through those doors knows their voice matters, regardless of what they look like or where they come from." He stood to leave, then paused. "I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to know, every life you save from here on out, every young engineer you mentor, every disaster you prevent, it's proof that good wins over evil, that competence beats prejudice, that you were always better than I was." I watched him walk away, shoulders hunched with the weight of his choices. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, no joy in his suffering. Just a profound sadness for all the years wasted, all the potential destroyed by fear and prejudice, but also hope. If Rick Williams could change, if he could finally see past his bias, then maybe others could too, before it cost lives. Today, as I write this story, I'm 47 years old. The scars on my hands have faded but never disappeared. They're a permanent reminder of what can happen when prejudice meets reality, and reality wins. The Johnson Center now has 150 students across 3 campuses. We've trained over 2,000 supervisors and managers in bias-free safety protocols. Our research has influenced federal policy and saved countless lives. But the moment I'm most proud of happened last week. A young black woman named Keisha Thompson, one of our first graduates, called to tell me she'd just been hired as chief safety officer at a major refinery in Louisiana. At 28, she's the youngest person ever to hold that position. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "I wanted to thank you, not just for the education, but for showing me what's possible. My supervisor treats me like the expert I am. My team respects my knowledge. And when I speak up about safety concerns, people listen." "That's how it should be," I told her. "I know, but it wasn't always this way. And I know it's not this way for everyone yet. But it's getting better, and that's because of what you did." After I hung up, I sat in my office thinking about the journey from that first day at Lone Star Chemical to now. The sabotage, the explosion, the burns, the recovery, the changes that followed. Rick Williams thought he was destroying one diversity hire. Instead, he created a movement that has transformed an entire industry. He thought he was protecting his position by tearing me down. Instead, he lost everything while elevating me to heights he never could have imagined. He thought prejudice was stronger than competence. He learned at a cost of 12 years in prison that he was wrong. See, here's what Rick Williams never understood. When you try to tear down someone who refuses to stay down, you don't just fail to stop them. You teach them how to lift others up. Every young engineer who faces what I face now has someone who's been there. Someone who knows how to fight back. Someone who's proven that excellence speaks louder than prejudice. Rick Williams thought he was sabotaging one diversity hire. Instead, he created a safety director who's made an entire industry safer for everyone, while he spent over a decade in federal prison learning what competence actually looks like. To every young black engineer reading this, every person who's been called a diversity hire, every professional who's had their competence questioned because of what they look like, your knowledge is real, your skills are earned, your voice matters, and when the alarms start going off, when the crisis hits, when lives are on the line, they're going to need you. Be ready. Study everything. Document everything. Build alliances with people who value competence over comfort. And never let anyone convince you that your expertise is worth less because of where you come from or what you look like. The best response to prejudice isn't anger. It's excellence so undeniable that even your enemies have to acknowledge it. The best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's building a world where people like you never have to prove themselves the way you did. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people who tried to destroy you end up in federal prison while you're testifying before Congress. This is Jalen Johnson, Director of Safety Operations at Lone Star Chemical and founder of the Johnson Center for Industrial Safety and Workplace Equity, reminding you that sometimes the person they underestimate the most is exactly the person who'll save their life. Your competence is your superpower. Never let anyone dim your light. And remember, while you're changing the world, they might just be serving time for their prejudice. Keep rising, keep building, keep proving that excellence has no color. The future belongs to the competent, not the comfortable. If Jalen Johnson's story of turning workplace sabotage into industry-wide change resonated with you, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Every week, I share stories about people who faced impossible odds and transformed entire systems through sheer determination. Hit that notification bell and tell me in the comments, have you ever had to prove your competence against prejudice? Your story could inspire our next video. Until next time, remember, they may underestimate you, but they can't underestimate the truth forever.